Hey, welcome into Carps Corner. Excited as always to catch up and dive into the weekend's events. A lot of stuff going on. Blue Blood Final Four, Kansas, North Carolina, Duke, Villanova, all of them won multiple titles. And so while we like the underdogs early, we get a little bit of that. And so that'll be a nice Final Four to be able to sit there and dive into. Some other, interesting news and stories out of the NFL, some other things that are transpiring. They've got their overtime rule, which we'll get into a little bit, but I don't want to sit there and belabor the point quite yet. Deshaun Watson Friday has his press conference in Cleveland. You've got the GM, head coach, Stefanski, Andrew Berry out there talking. Unfortunately, Haslam's were down in their winter meetings for the owners' meetings. And now you have the NFL winter meetings that are occurring right now. And so, weren't there, virtually touched base. And we'll talk a little bit about the structure of how that happened. And maybe if Cleveland maybe should have handled it a little bit differently and gone about it in a different order, because there's a lot of questions. And with that, questions about Baker Mayfield, his future, where he's going to be. There's a report, Joe Thomas was talking about in his podcast that, apparently there's maybe an opportunity for Baker to get a deal done in Cleveland last year. And apparently they necessarily weren't on the same page with that and what that could have potentially looked like. And maybe there was wildly different asks, and maybe they never got into formal talks because, it was since, I wouldn't say debunked, but responded to on the other side, saying that that's not true. John Harbaugh finding a way to change practice out in Baltimore so he doesn't suffer the catastrophic injuries he doesn't. And the New York Giants, Saquon Barkley, are they shopping him or are they not? It's a big question to ask. And Daniel Jones, how committed are they to him? John Merritt, had some comments on that. And I'll respond and talk you through the process of that in the NFL and quarterbacks. And, put your money where your mouth is. If you really like somebody, well, let's go all in on them and not beat around the bush, if you will, and say you're interested, but really not. And then finally, some good news, some great news. We'll start with this. Some great news for Buffalo. Buffalo Bills going to get a new stadium, about $1.5 billion. Finally came to this resolution. And this is something that has been plaguing the city of Buffalo for a while. The Ralph Wilson Stadium, one of the oldest stadiums in the NFL. It's not great. The visiting locker room, I'll tell you, is absolute trash. Tiny, small, not many showers. It's very antiquated, especially by NFL standards. They did the best they could to bring it up to date, but the Pagulas wanted to make sure that they're keeping the Bills in Buffalo, and they're doing so with a really, really nice stadium. And so this thing is going to be great. It probably won't be the biggest thing in the world because it's in Buffalo. So don't build it bigger than it needs to be. Give it what it needs. It's going to be a football-specific stadium. It's going to be one of the most expensive stadiums you're going to have probably on per foot and by amenities, just given the fact that construction and inflation are going through the roof right now. And so as anybody's trying to do a renovation, build anything, they completely get it. They understand. But about $1.5 billion, here's how it breaks out. $600 million from the state of New York, $250 million from Erie County. NFL is throwing in their $150 million on a forgivable loan. The Pagulas are throwing in $350, and then they'll have to pay another $50 million back to the NFL. That's how it's going to structure. I could not be happier for Bills fans. You finally got your quarterback, the franchise in Josh Allen. You have him surrounded with weapons. That sounds great. You've got the people that you need up there to be able to make the big trade for Diggs. They have that. Your new stadium now, it's going to be in there, about $1.5, $1.4 billion stadium that's going to be up in Buffalo, keeping them there. You have a good head coach in Sean McDermott. You feel like a capable front office, owners that are willing to spend money. It's a good time to be a Buffalo Bills fan, and you feel like they're really in a nice spot if that's going to be the case. And all of these things work out. It's going before, the New York legislature to get all this approved. But I'm glad to see that this thing was able to work. The Pagulas, they're chipping in a decent chunk now. They're on the hook for $400 million of this thing. And so while, you've got about 600 coming from the state and another 250 coming from the county, it's tough because Buffalo doesn't have the industry. They don't necessarily have the thriving economy that they did 50 or 60 years ago. But that is what sets the NFL apart. The fact that Green Bay, Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo, smaller markets can have these fantastic franchises that, when given proper ownership, good coaching, and they draft well, they can go out and have tons of success. And so I tip my cap to Buffalo, the city, the fans, everybody, because they deserve this. The city and the fans deserve this as much as anyone. It would have been a shame to see the fact that they finally get the quarterback right for the first time since Jim Kelly. Finally look like they have another team. It's been almost 30 stinking years since the Bills have been able to go do this. They've got everything set to compete from a player, an organizational, a coaching, and a front office standpoint. Now they just needed the stadium, and they are getting it. And so, Buffalo fans, pat yourselves on the back. You deserve it. I'm glad the Pagulas did the right thing. They're keeping them there. The city and the state stepped up. And I'm not for publicly funded stadiums. But in the case with Buffalo, there's other viable options that they could have went if you were the Bills, and would have been probably more profitable and would have put them in a better situation financially. And so the Pagulas, they're not getting a handout. They're throwing in close to $400 million of their own money, which you can be as rich as you want. That is not cheap. It's going to cost a lot. And so in doing so, they're going to be able to preserve the game in an unbelievable environment with a fan base that really deserves success. Wanted to start off with that good news because it's fantastic and it's great to see. Some news coming out of Joe Thomas's podcast, longtime Browns left tackle, works for NFL Network, does a great job. I think it was him and Hawkins sitting there chopping it up. And, apparently it was reported that the Browns had kind of floated an offer out there of about 30 million, somewhere in the $30 million range for Baker, prior to the season or early in the season. And Baker's representation, they declined that. Now it's come out, Mary Kay Cabot is vehemently denying that this was ever the case, and there's ever serious or substantive negotiations. And there may have never been big time negotiations to bring Baker back. But I guarantee you his agent and the Browns front office probably sat down and maybe had some casual calls while even talking about other people, other potential players, all these things. Hey, we're getting to the 5th-year option. Hey, what's going to happen here? Hey, how's $30 million sound? You know what? Baker's representation, we're not even close to interested. His team, we're more 40. And when hearing that, maybe at that point, that's when the Browns decided to move on. The fact that they may have floated out a trial balloon, just real easy going. And if Joe Thomas is reporting it, then I guarantee you there's some validity to it. If he's talking about it, that it was probably floated out there. And the Baker side said, no way. This guy's a top 5 quarterback, top 5 money. He's next in line. He wants that $40 million deal. And the Browns brass probably, hey, think we can win with him, but we can't afford paying this guy $10 million more a year than we actually believe he's worth and what he can go do for our franchise. And so it makes a lot of sense to me because they have a lot of these conversations and people will throw out numbers. I don't believe they probably ever really got to the bargaining table because the Browns probably looked at this as, hey, this guy's maybe low to mid 30s. He's asking for over 40. Worst case, we're probably with them settling on between 38 and $41 million. And we can't afford to pay a guy that who we believe we need to spend that other $7 to $10 on players surrounding him to make sure that we're in a good spot. And so because of that, they obviously pursued Deshaun Watson, and now they're still left with Baker on their roster, and he's ultimately due about $18 million for this season, guaranteed 5th-year option. So you're the Cleveland Browns. What are you going to do? It looks like there's no trade market for him. He would have been in the Texans deal. He wasn't there. You look at Atlanta, you look potentially at New Orleans, Seattle, even Carolina. There's really no interest from any of those teams. You could maybe get him interested if you said, hey, if you're the Browns, we're going to take on 2/3 of his salary. You kick us back a 6th-round pick. All right, maybe that gets it done. You can shed some cash off your books. And so since he's guaranteed that money, why are the Browns trying to trade him when they know there's really no realistic partners? Well, if you trade a guy, at least you know where he's going to be the next year. And so here's the scenario that I'm going to float out to you. and people are talking about this. You look at the Pittsburgh Steelers. You got Mitchell Trubisky, got Dwayne Haskins. That's essentially, you know, what their quarterback room is going to be comprised of, you know, going into next year. Like it's not necessarily the prettiest room you're going to find. And I think, you know, they're going to give Mitchell Trubisky a shot to see what he can ultimately do. But it's not a great situation leaving Big Ben. I believe, and I think a lot of other people do, that the Pittsburgh Steelers would have an interest in Baker Mayfield. He would be a substantial upgrade over whoever they have there right now in that room and whoever ultimately is going to be the starter. And the Browns, I doubt they want that to happen. And I go back, a good friend of mine, co-host for 5 years, Anthony Rothman, one of the best fantasy GMs, regardless of sport you'll ever find. And before he ever makes a move, he always says, I like to ask myself this question: can this player come back to haunt me? And I think the Browns recognize that Baker can be streaky and Baker has some talent. He's maybe not the guy we want long-term, but Baker Mayfield can do some damage. The last thing they want is him ultimately going to Pittsburgh and having success there, winning a starting job, and then coming back and beating you in your own shop. The last thing the Browns want to happen. Could it happen? Yeah, I think there's a real possibility. You look at Baker Mayfield and how he's wired. He's a vengeful dude. That helps drive him. That's made him really good. It's made him successful in life, is the fact that he likes to push against the man. He likes to go against the grain, against all odds. And he's a guy that's very emotional and I believe would want some level of vengeance. And so with that, him wanting that and desiring those things, he would probably go to Pittsburgh and maybe go there. It doesn't matter how much he's getting paid because it's all guaranteed from Cleveland. Maybe there's offset language, maybe not. I mean, who doesn't really matter. They'll probably pay him a couple $1,000,000 and he would go there just to resurrect his career in hopes of becoming the Steelers starting quarterback and saying, you know what, this is where it's going to be. Now I get to go beat these guys. I wasn't good enough for them. Even though I beat Pittsburgh in the playoffs, they don't want me. They don't want me there. So now I'm going to go 100 miles to the east and head to the city of Pittsburgh, maybe about 150 miles to the east to the city of Pittsburgh. And that's where I'll make my home. And I'll be embraced by Steelers fans. You know, are the Browns ultimately be able to stop this? I don't know what I don't know what lever they would have to do that, because I don't believe they'll carry Baker Mayfield into the season. I don't think they're going to have a trade partner, and teams realize that they'll eventually release him. So they'll just wait him out. They'll wait him out. For Pittsburgh, you know, they're not going to trade with you in the division. And why give up something for him? Why take on any portion of the salary when Cleveland can eat it all? And then you can give him a couple $1,000,000 to come in and compete. I mean, that sounds like the most logical situation that you're going to be able to find. And I believe that Baker would be very interested in that. Now, is Pittsburgh, are they interested in Baker? I've heard rumblings that they would be, should he become available. Because their situation isn't great. And I think that might be worst case scenario for the Browns fans. But let's be honest. I trying to envision another scenario that would be more Cleveland than that. The guy you draft #1 overall, who you think is the guy who ultimately gets hurt, you have to trade, bring someone else in, you're forced to release him. He goes to your rival ultimately to come back and beat you. I can't think of a more Cleveland Browns scenario. I mean, it is what it is. I can't imagine something happening more Cleveland than that. And looking at it like another way, looking at this from the Cleveland scenario, they're going to have to probably release him. I think Pittsburgh ultimately would bring him in, and then that'll be that. So I love analyzing like the different tentacles of this entire process of what we've seen. So I think about this. If you're the Steelers, then, you know, you have Mitchell Trubisky was the #2 overall pick. Dwayne Haskins, who was a top 20 pick, who Washington took. Bears took Trubisky. Browns took Baker #1 overall. And so when we talk about the price tag for Deshaun Watson, 3 #1s, That sounds like a heck of a lot. But pretend this for a second. Let's say that Baker is cut and signed ultimately by Pittsburgh. You would have the number 1 overall pick, a number 2 overall pick, and a top 20 quarterback pick, all potentially on your roster. That's 3 number 1s. The Browns gave up 3 number 1s for a guy who is a proven commodity. Draft picks are great, folks, but there's a reason why the Denver Broncos gave up so much to be able to get Russell Wilson. There's a reason why the Cleveland Browns gave up so much to be able to get Deshaun Watson. Picks are only good when you hit. And I don't know if there's a position that's more difficult to be able to draft and evaluate from college to the NFL than the quarterback position. So 3 number 1s, while it sounds steep, you may draft 3 quarterbacks in the first round in 6 years and still not get your guy. So if there's a guy out there that can be had who wants to ultimately play with you, go get him. Go get him. That's what the Cleveland Browns figured out. It's not worth it for us to sit here and just keep horsing around and trying to draft guys. Like, let's go get a guy. We'll guarantee his deal and we'll move on forward and we'll see if he can be the guy. But we know he was somewhere else, so we feel pretty confident that we can build around him. And Deshaun Watson's that dude. But 3 first-round draft picks, it's a lot. And I understand there's salary control and there's everything else that comes with that. But there are teams that will draft 4 and 5 quarterbacks. Think of Buffalo, what they've done. Look at Cleveland before they got Deshaun. You look at Denver, what they've done outside of Peyton Manning. You're drafting a lot of guys and they're ultimately not working out and not panning out. And because of that, sometimes you might as well just push the chips in and go for it and say, I'll eat it and make this trade. That sounds like something that's more logical to do, and it'll be easier to digest. And we're getting a known commodity and a known quantity in doing so. Now, the Deshaun Watson presser was last week, and it was really tough because you have all these issues for the Browns. Number one, you're wanting to introduce a new quarterback, so you want this thing to be the confetti and excitement and everything going on. Number two, there's obviously the pending civil cases that were going on, the criminal cases, which were dismissed and they weren't even brought with charges, but that's still out there. And in doing so, then you have a guaranteed contract, trade compensation, and Baker Mayfield still on the roster. And so while they try to do it with the head coach, GM, and front office, and you've got your quarterback and Deshaun Watson there, like there's a lot of different questions that need to be asked. It almost feels like they should have put Stefanski and Andrew Berry out there for their own presser on their own day. Go give them an hour. That way people can ask about Baker. They can ask about the process of trading for Watson with him not right beside you. The thought of giving up all that compensation, the top of the topic of the biggest guaranteed contract in NFL history. All of those things are relevant, but all of them are kind of individual, and some of them pertain to Watson, some of them don't. And especially with the Baker stuff, like, what are you going to do with him? People want to know. They want those questions answered. The problem is, like, are you really going to ask about Baker Mayfield, and they're going to really give you the time and the answer if Deshaun Watson's sitting there? But he's still on the roster, and what they're ultimately going to do with it matters. And then you had the Haslam's, Jimmy and D come in, and I know they were at the owners' meetings, and so it was a little bit tougher for them trying to parcel and piece that together and handle all that, just given the location. But I thought they handled everything pretty well. If you look at it and how they were able to operate, I think that they did as good a job as they ultimately could have. Not necessarily the easiest thing to do, but I thought that they did check the boxes and get it done in an appropriate way. Looking back and giving it, the full weekend to reflect everything. There were no major gaffes that came out of it. And for the Cleveland Browns, I think you would say that's huge. And that's really exciting for them to ultimately see happen. Staying within the division, looking out east, the Baltimore Ravens were decimated by injury last year. And John Harbaugh, has been, kind of noted as running a tough camp, tough practices. And, there was conversations, with Ed Reed and Ray Lewis over the years, like lightening up and trying to kind of get away from it. And there is a certain element where, like, hey, this is the culture of the Ravens. We're a tough physical team. We practice hard. we're going to hit, we're going to do all this stuff. But running back room absolutely decimated last year. Defensive backfield by the end of the season was decimated. And so John Harbaugh comes out, and I respect him for saying this. So you're going to have to make some changes to how we operate. Get less time with the players on the field, less taxing on those guys. We don't want to go as hard during practice. We have more time to ramp things up. You know, sometimes coaches, hey, they think everybody should just be ready to go, and that's part of it. But the other side is too, sometimes you got to ease guys into things a little bit and build those practices and start adding more, and then obviously decrease the time on your feet while you're out there. And so lowering intensity, more ramp up time, less practice time. Like, I think John Harbaugh has figured it out that, you know, having a tough team, they can go out there and bully people. Well, that's all well and good, but you'd rather have your full complement of players to be able to go out there as well. You need your J.K. Dobbinses. You need your defensive backs. You have to be able to have those guys to go out there and make sure that you have a roster that can help Lamar Jackson, who is going to eventually need a new deal coming here soon. So good for John Harbaugh, taking inventory of what happened last year and understanding that, you know what, maybe we should change things up and accepting that criticism and making those changes. That's big time ball for John Harbaugh, understanding that and knowing that he had to do those things and make those changes. I want to finish up with the New York Giants here. And Giants are, quote, like not actively shopping Saquon Barkley. That's kind of perplexing to me. I mean, I understand, you know, what you gave up in the draft to go get him. You know, he's a top 5 draft pick, really, really talented player. And all those things make sense. But, you know, at the end of it, I don't know if your team's really set up to win now. You've got a new coach coming in Brian Daboll. You got a quarterback that's unproven, which we'll get to in a minute. You know, it doesn't look like you're all that talented. Now, I know they've tried to do some things in free agency. They'll try to beef this up in the draft. But you ask the question, do they believe in Daniel Jones? Well, John Mara comes out and says, you know, in the NFL, either you have a QB or you don't. We believe we do. Well, John, who I love, I was a Giants fan growing up. If you think you have your quarterback, you probably should pick up his 5th-year option, which I don't believe the Giants have done yet with Daniel Jones. They haven't offered him any type of extension. There's no 5th-year option that has been picked up yet. And so are you trying to sit here and, you know, play this thing out and see how well he plays early in the year? And if he struggles, then maybe and Saquon Barkley's playing well, then maybe you use Barkley as, you know, dangle him out at the trade deadline. But I don't think you'd be getting full value at that point for him. And so it's really a confusing situation the Giants are trying to straddle here. I don't think Daniel Jones is the guy. Maybe I could be wrong. They believe he is. And so you want to keep Saquon Barkley to kind of see what he is and allow them to try to prove it. But in doing so, are you really getting the value out of Barkley? Like, what has he really given you over his tenure? He's gotten beat up a lot. You haven't had a great offensive line. You're trying to remedy some of those problems, trying to make some of these things better. But the Giants just seem to kind of be sputtering in no man's land. And the reality is, too, they're in a division in the NFC East that's very winnable. And so they need to take aggressive steps, go try to win this thing, and put themselves in a good position right now. But in doing that, you have to be honest with yourself in your evaluation of who your quarterback is and where your team is at. And it'd probably be prudent for them that if they could get some decent compensation for Saquon Barkley, probably should have moved on, because there are teams out there that I'm fairly certain would give it to you, since, you know, you didn't have to necessarily pay the full freight to get him, and you're not drafting him in the top 5. You're throwing out a 2nd or 3rd round pick to potentially bring him home. Lastly, non-sports related, want to finish with this. You know, the Chris Rock comments, the jokes about Jada Pinkett Smith, Will Smith's wife, G.I. Jane 2, the fact she's bald, you know, suffering from some alopecia issues. And for any woman, I can imagine that would be very troubling. And the fact that he threw that out there in public, Will laughed at it, then gets up, open hand smacks him at the Oscars. Absolutely insane. Absolute insanity. I understand where Chris Rock's coming from. I mean, we've got to the point now where you can't make fun of anything, and there's the no fun police. And I appreciate comedians who are going to continue to push the envelope. And when we're in such a PC world, and I think Chris Rock is one of the best at it. He's always pushed the envelope, and he does it in a fun and jestful way. A lot of profanity. But I do respect Will Smith. To me, there's a couple things you don't mess with in life. You want to pick at someone's family. It better be something that's open and obvious, that's out there for everyone. Talk about Will Smith and his wife having more of an open relationship. If you want to poke fun at that, go for it. Because that's something that, she talks about. Will Smith is, kind of talked about, and it's out there. It's not hidden. But medical issues with you or your family, to me, that's where it kind of crosses the line. You don't make fun of someone's kid if they're sick or they're or handicapped. Like, why would you make fun of someone's wife if they're sick? Like, she lost her hair. That's a humbling experience, I would have to imagine, for a woman. And I do respect Will Smith getting up there, gives him the open hand smack. Maybe he should have gave him a closed fist punch. We can debate that back and forth, but I did enjoy seeing it. I relished in it, and I thought it was entertaining as heck. And by the way, if I would have known that was going to happen, I actually would have watched the Oscars. I did not watch 1 minute of it outside of what I've seen on social media. Maybe it brings me back in. Who knows? Maybe I'll watch next year. But that's it for this edition of Carps Corner. I appreciate you tuning in. Going to keep this thing rolling. We have the Final Four coming up. All kinds of goodness and excitement this weekend. And I'm sure there'll continue to be more NFL news and more updates from Ohio State spring practice as well. That's it for this edition of Carps Corner. Thanks for tuning in.